think we're okay now. And welcome to this Mass Peace Action webinar with Dr. Juliet Schor. My name is Rosalie Anders, and I'm co-chair of one of MAPPA's 9 working groups, the Peace and Climate Group. So we look at how war, peace, militarism are linked to climate change and work on ways to bring together people involved in those issues to become a stronger voice for change. And we try to look at the shared roots of climate change and militarism and whether we can solve either of them without changing our exploitive, expansionist economy, which is why we were really excited to invite Dr. Schor to come. There's a lot of good information on MAPPA's website about our activities, and there are all kinds of ways to be involved. I believe MAPPA is one of the strongest voices for the change we need, and one of the pleasures of working on issues with MAPPA is that you get to do it with amazing people. So one of these people is Dr. Paula Gottlob, who will moderate the webinar and introduce Dr. Schor. Paula is a teacher, trainer, and international consultant on negotiation, leadership, and conflict management. And she's a longtime active member of Mass Peace Action. So, Paula.
Thank you so much, Rosalie. It's such a pleasure to be here. Rosalie and I were speaking about my setting a context for why we're doing this webinar. And the first thing we thought of discussing was that in this current political climate, we're so often finding ourselves in a reactive mode, protesting, resisting. They're the forces that are propelling us towards this devastating future of war and destruction. And yeah, I get it. Resistance is essential, but it's really crucial that we also be for something, that we hold a vision of where we want to go, of the desired future that we want of peace and cooperation. And Rosalie and I were talking about the fact that we really need to have a change in consciousness in order to attain this hopeful vision. Right now, what's being sold is this vision of scarcity and fear and division. And we need a shift in consciousness to abundance and courage and connection. And that's why we've asked Dr. Julie Schor to speak with us this evening. Our current economic system is based on the pursuit of endless growth, destructive activities with enormous human, environmental, and climate costs. Dr. Schor will present steps we can take to shift to a more just and environmentally stable, sustainable economy. And she's going to draw out the implications of economic transformation on international conflict. So Julie Schor is an economist and a professor of sociology at Boston College. Dr. Schor's research focuses on work, consumption, and climate change. She's been studying working time since the 1980s, and in 1992, she published The Overworked American, The Unexpected Decline of Leisure, which became a national bestseller. Since 2021, she's been a lead researcher on work time reduction. She's looking at the barriers to work time reduction. She's looking at the connections between working hours and carbon emissions, the well-being impacts of work time reduction, and how companies are implementing a 4-day work week. Her broader research interests include consumer society, consumer culture, working hours and lifestyle, environmental degradation, the emergence of sustainable consumption and production, the new sharing economy, and alternative sustainable economies and societies. Dr. Schor will speak for about 35 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions with the audience. We ask that you put your questions in the chat and start your entry with a capital Q or the word question, and we'll review the questions in the chat, and then we'll call on you to ask your question. Dr. Schor, we're very much looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Paula. It's a great pleasure to be here. as some of you know, my husband is a long-term board member of MAPA, Preston and Park Society, and so we've been, I've been following and, very supportive of the work that you all have been doing for quite a while. So I'm going to start my own timer, and when 35 minutes happens, it's going to be an abrupt and awful sound, and that will just tell me that I need to wrap up. So yes, really looking forward to sharing the work that I've been doing with you and then having a conversation about it. I am not an expert on militarism and conflict, but I am going to try and at least draw a few connections, which I think are pretty important for understanding some of the things that we need to change in order to have a more peaceable and sustainable world. So let me share my screen, and I'm going to start by showing you some slides. Okay. So, 5 steps to a sustainable and peaceable economy. And I'm going to start with the 5 steps. I'm not going to talk in depth about all of them, but here they go. Here I go. Number 1, decarbonize everything. Number 2, stop expanding the size of the economy. 3, reverse extreme inequality. Address racism and restore democracy. Why these? How can we enact them? I'm going to focus on the first few and the connections among them. So number 1, the drivers of ecological degradation and war. The first that I want to identify is the growth imperative. And this has been really key, particularly since the end of the Second World War, for the global economy, particularly the economies of the West, then the socialist bloc that were trying to compete with the West. And so we have been in an era in which growth centricity, or the growth imperative, has been really key in terms of so much of our policy has been oriented to growing.
Julie, your
Yes.
slides are coming through very small. I wonder if you can do presenter view.
That's that one.
That's much better. Thank you.
Yeah, it just, I've got 2 monitors going here, and
Right.
sorry about that.
Better.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thank you for stopping me. Growth imperative. Here we are. This is GDP in price corrected terms. So it's real gross domestic product. And this is per capita. So of course, we've had this tremendous growth in population, which would, give us even a much greater increase here. But since 1960, you can see that we've had, a 3 times increase in GDP per capita. And of course, we were probably at, just nearing 1 billion people at that point. So the growth imperative, that's number 1. Number 2 is fossil fuel use, really key for understanding what's going on. And it's, of course, fossil fuel use is driving climate destabilization. Here we have both the amount of global atmospheric CO2. We're now at that 220 parts per million in the atmosphere, and we went from that blue area, which is lower than average temperatures, so a cooling period up until mid-20th century, and then of course we have this very rapid acceleration of temperature since then, and we're really pretty much going off the charts at this point. So growth imperative, fossil fuel use, and this has been a fossil fuel economy. It's coterminous with the shift to a market-based capitalist economy, and there's a lot of debate about sort of how much of what's happening is because it's fossils, how much is the structure of the economy. It's absolutely both. So the growth imperative and the fact that it's fossil fuels really key, and we can talk more about that. Third thing is extreme and rising inequality. Now, by extreme, we're talking about levels of inequality which are historically unprecedented. Here we have global wealth inequality. It's a nice little way of doing it. If there were only 10 people in the world, the 10th person, or maybe the first person, would have over 3/4 of the world's wealth. The next person has 11%. And of course, we have these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I mean, really up to the 7, even 8, 80% who have almost nothing in terms of shares of the world wealth. So historically unprecedented. You have within country extreme inequality. We have across country extreme inequality, and that both of those have intensified in recent years. The second thing, here's the United States, share of the top 1% in the US. So since the Great Recession, these folks have tripled their wealth. This is, excuse me, this is not share. I said share. I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. Wealth of the top 1%. We know also their share has gone up by so much, but this is a tripling of their absolute levels of wealth. And of course, you've heard a lot about Musk and Bezos and Gates and these folks who are now in the many, many billions. Another key dimension of extreme inequality is extreme racial inequality. So this is median household wealth by race and ethnicity in the United States between 1983 and 2024. Average people suffered a lot with the Great Recession. You can see that dip in, this is the white wealth. And this is where we are. This is forecast, but from this point, these numbers aren't, it's a little bit hard to get the very updated ones. But you can see here where the average white household has 161,000 in wealth. So that's assets minus debt. Black and Latin households have only about 10,000. So there's an extreme inequality in racial wealth. And then this is a global story. This is from Thomas Piketty's World Inequality Database from 1980 until just about 2018. And then these predictions, but you can see the top 1% has been rising. There's a global middle class whose share has been declining. This is the top 1/10 of 1%, and this is the top 100th of 1%. And you can see that soaring wealth there. So extreme inequality is a global phenomenon, and we are at levels of inequality that we just have never seen in the world. And that's really, it's creating economic dynamics which are new and very, very troubling. So these three drivers that I've identified, the three things that are really driving us toward unsustainability and war and conflict are very highly connected. So I've identified growth imperative, fossil fuels, and extreme inequality. So you have here, for example, this is the so-called champagne glass distribution, which is here we're not looking at income, but we're looking at share of CO2 emissions, consumption-based CO2 emissions. So the top 10% are responsible for half of all the emissions. And this is a really important point because so much of the climate discourse has been what I call a pogo discourse from that famous cartoon, Pogo, we have met the enemy and he is us. And the point is that it's not that the enemy is us. It's not ordinary, everyday people who are driving the climate crisis. The disproportionality in who is responsible for carbon emissions, whether it's by country, whether it's by companies. Of course, there are those 100 carbon majors that are responsible for more than 3/4 of all carbon emissions. or if we think about it with households. And then, of course, you have this bottom 50% who are only responsible for about 8% of emissions. And so, you know, a lot of the discourse about international things has really focused on India and China, and they have so many people. But of course, the vast majority of folks in those countries contribute so little. Here we have carbon dioxide emissions and economic growth. They are very highly coupled. And for those of you who work in this area at all or read in it, you will know there's a big literature on what's called decoupling, which means separating carbon emissions from economic growth, because many people and sort of elites have really tried to sort of save economic growth in the face of the carbon crisis, the climate crisis, arguing that, well, no, we can just separate these two things, and so we can continue to grow and it won't increase carbon emissions. And while there has been some progress recently, for the most part, until very recently, in very few countries have we seen the ability to grow without increasing carbon emissions. And that's not even really the issue. The issue is these dramatic declines in emissions that we have to achieve, particularly those of us in the wealthy countries who are the so-called legacy polluters, meaning the CO2 that's in the atmosphere. We bear primary responsibility for that. And it's, you know, we've got to do more than just decouple. We've got to actually get really dramatic reductions in our carbon emissions. I think everyone in this Zoom room knows that. And but what we've seen is how very difficult that is. And one of the reasons is that although renewables have increased so far, they haven't displaced fossil fuels to the extent that they need to for us to get those big emissions. And then the third of the drivers, of course, is the connection between oil and fossil fuels and the U.S. military. And this is a map of bases. I know MAP has done so much work on this kind of thing. And of course, what's most evident here is that incredible concentration of bases in the West Asia, or what's called the Middle East, the oil-producing countries there. And you can, if you see where the U.S. has been trying to expand in recent years, there's a lot of activity around pipelines and new oil supplies and so forth. And so we can't understand what's going on with the U.S. military and its aggressive posture around the world without understanding the role of oil. Oil has been absolutely central to U.S. Military and political strategy for more than a century now. And we can see it in maps like this. And, you know, that's something we can talk more about in the Q&A. But if we were able to decarbonize everything, my first step, that is absolutely get off oil and gas, and of course coal, then the possibilities for a far more peaceable foreign policy, I think, are really expanded, because we would no longer be so concerned to secure overseas oil. Now, together, the growth imperative and the has been linked to a large number of ecological crises. This has been called the Great Acceleration, and it begins in after the Second World War. And what you can see on the orange ones are socioeconomic trends. So the growth in GDP, the growth in foreign direct investment, and then the use of water and the production of paper, fertilizer, primary energy use. Of course, that's fossil fuels, populations, tourism, etc. And then these are the range of ecological problems that have developed, whether it's, of course, the buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, or methane, another potent greenhouse gas, ozone layer problems, ocean acidification, forest lost, habitat lost, terrestrial biosphere degradation, and so forth. So that the sort of the big picture of what we could call ecocide is tightly coupled here with these trends in production. Population is a complex one. We can talk more about that. So how do we address these drivers of war and ecocide? As I said, decarbonize everything. That's where I'm starting. And in some ways, it's probably the easiest step. Not to say that it is easy, but compared to my other four, why? The first thing is, what Bill McKibben has called "Here Comes the Sun." And, if I were playing music, I would put on that wonderful Beatles song. But take a look at what has happened to solar panel costs, because for every doubling of global capacity, they've fallen by about 20%. So we've gone from a world in which a megawatt of a solar PV module cost of is 100 for, and that was the world of 1 megawatts, 1975, about the time when Carter put those panels on the White House. And now we're down to, less than 5 cents. So it's just been an absolutely extraordinary collapse of these prices. You have something similar in wind. We've got something similar going on in batteries, which I'm going to show you. But what has changed dramatically in the last few years is the economic conditions around renewable energy, particularly solar and batteries, but wind also. So we are in a whole new world in which, when many of us started worrying about the climate destabilization, it was getting off fossil fuels had an economic cost because they were cheaper, at least in market terms. Of course, there are a lot of subsidies for them, and all of the costs of air pollution and health impacts and impacts on indigenous people and so forth. Those weren't counted in the market calculus. But even just taking the market calculus, what's happening now is we have renewables which are cheaper and increasingly much cheaper than fossils. Incumbents, meaning fossil fuel producers, have underestimated the speed of change. And this is a wonderful new report by the Rocky Mountain Institute, in which they're showing that finally we are in the moment of exponential growth, whether we're talking about, and what they call this S curve, new solar, EV, and batteries, and are all driven by the cost trends. But take a look here. I mean, this is just really always underestimating what's going to be happening time year after year after year after year. These gray lines are what we're forecast, and we're at this very high end here in terms of what's actually happening. So something big is happening, and it may lead us into a really new era if we can keep the political forces which are trying to maintain fossils. This is the so-called S curve of deployment. You see that China has led the way in EVs as well as solar and wind. Europe and the US lagging behind, but even US and Europe are really on that steep curve now. So decarbonizing everything reshapes geopolitics. It eliminates US interests in the Middle East. It undermines petrostates like Russia and Iran, who are key in understanding the nexus of conflict. And it opens the door for a far more peaceable foreign policy. So what about the next step, which is getting out of the growth imperative? Now, many people will have heard the term degrowth, which is a movement popular in Europe, although it's now being renamed, I think, I'm very thankful about that, to something called post-growth. It doesn't seem quite so negative, but this has been a really politically very difficult sell in the United States, the idea of deliberate shrinkage. And although what I'm going to talk about next, which is work time reduction, the thing I've spent a lot of time working on, is it's a very positive vision. I mean, Paula talked at the beginning about a positive vision and not just being reactive and defensive and sort of fighting off all the forces that are coming at us, but putting forward a pathway that's really going to be sustainable, peaceable, meet people's needs, etc. I typically don't use these terms, but what I'm going to show you and argue is there is a pathway that allows us to move off the growth trajectory, but in ways that really make people much better off. Not just a little bit better off, but actually profoundly better off. And it doesn't involve expanding the economy. So is there a pathway? Yes. And one of the really gratifying things that happened for me in the last IPCC report was they finally started talking about work time reduction, including, citing my work and saying, look, we have to start to talk about this. It's 2023. I think it came out in 2023. It's about time that we are talking about work time reduction as a key policy to help get us onto a low demand path, which means a low growth path or even a zero. So the first point to say is that the West has a history of robust work time reduction. Between 1870 and 1970, average working hours in this set of countries, and I could add many more, went from about 3,000 down to, in many cases, about 1,800 hours. You can see here Japan is an outlier. I'm going to show you something interesting about Japan in a minute. But most of these countries move not exactly at the same rate, but they all move down. And by the way, you can see the US here way ahead of most of these other countries. So when people say, oh, we can't do this in the US, we're a workaholic nation, they're usually surprised when I say, yes, but we led the world in work time reduction for many, many decades. And so it's not something that is baked into our DNA. However, the US has stalled out. So if we look since 1973 until the pandemic, we are this little dotted line here. We're just kind of bumping around without too much decline. And these numbers understate because they're from enterprises, from companies rather from individuals, so they don't include multiple job holdings and so forth. That book that I wrote that Paula referenced showed actually, a bigger increase in work time here. But here's that interesting thing about Japan, which is now, that's the blue line here. Look how high they were, down, down, down. They are now below the United States. Japan was, of course, famously a very highly workaholic country. Of course, India and China here going in the other direction from everybody else. But, here's our German friends, under 1,400 hours a year. We've got the Netherlands down here, France, etc. So the Western European countries stayed on that trajectory of working time reduction that I showed you. So the pandemic hit and suddenly work time reduction was on the map. And these are just a few of the many, many stories in the media, mostly about the work that we've been doing on a 4-day week. Of course, you may have heard the UAW put a 32-hour work week demand into its last contract talks. But these are reports of the trials that we've been doing, which I'm going to show you now, and why 2023 could finally be the year of the 4-day work week. But I think 2024, 2025, and going forward are also going to be really important years. So why did it happen? What is propelling the 4-day work week? Most important thing is pandemic-induced but persistent employee distress and quits. So this is a post-pandemic number, but here, this is a global number. The US is very similar. Did you experience the following feelings a lot of the day yesterday? 44% say yes about stress. And if you ask, this is from Gallup, and they're trying to figure out how are people doing. Only 23% globally are thriving at work. 60% are not engaged, or what's called quiet quitting, and then 18% are loud quitting. This is the US and Canada, very, very similar, high levels of intent to leave. And even if they are working from home, the numbers aren't different. In 2022, this is US searches from burnout from work on Google, so just absolutely soaring. And this is our quit rate, which you may remember, the Great Resignation. Although it's come down since then, it's still historically quite high, a long period in which quits were not so high. And these are unfilled job vacancies, again, historically quite high. A few issues with these numbers, but so they may overstate a bit. Very quickly, how did we get to the 5-day week? It's a really important question for understanding how we might get to the 4-day week. Organized labor claims that they were the ones who did it. It's not exactly true. It was Jewish Sabbatarians, and in particular garment workers, owners of garment companies, who were the very first group to move to a 4-day week. And in fact, the Feuersteins, who from Brookline, they owned the Malden Mills, which became famous when they rebuilt it after a fire and didn't rebuild it here in the United States and didn't go overseas. But the ancestor Feuerstein was the very first recorded anyway employer to go to a 4-day week. And then it began to spread. 1920, here's Factory, the magazine of management, talking about the growing number of companies who are going to a 5-day week. And then, of course, Henry Ford announcing it earlier, but putting it in 1926. And then you get the Fair Labor Standards Act, and the 40-hour week actually comes in 1940. At the beginning, labor was against it. They were worried it would reduce wages, but once the Depression came, they came on board. And in fact, in the textile, the amalgamated came on board a bit earlier. So what we're seeing today is very, very reminiscent of what happened in the 1920s, which was starting with sort of foresighted employers, typically in small companies, and those are the ones that we're mostly studying, who put in this innovation, both to give their workers more free time, but also obviously for the Jewish employers to have a Sabbath on Saturday, and then the movement grew from there. And of course, the Depression was really key. So as I say, the contemporary 4-day week movement is following the same pattern. So I have been studying companies all around the world who are giving their employees 32-hour weeks with 40 hours of pay. So no reduction in pay, 4 days, 4 8-hour days, not the compressed work week. The first, and they are enrolling in what we call trials or pilots. They get 2 months of coaching and help to try and help them figure out how they can get all their productivity in 4 days. Now, not every company tries to do this, but many of them do. And then they go to 6-month trials, and the vast majority of them have continued beyond the 6 months and beyond a year. And in fact, now we have many of them that are past the two years already, and we'll be getting into 3 years soon for some of them. We have had hundreds of companies and thousands of workers. Ireland and the US was our first trial, and then another one with US, Canada, the UK, the biggest trial we've had so far. Australia, New Zealand, another US, Canada, Europe, a sort of mixed trial, South Africa, Canada, Germany. We also have collaborators using our survey instruments in Portugal, in Brazil, and they're starting in Italy, Sweden, Norway, Belgium, maybe India, Israel. There was a trial, lots of places all around the world. So what do we find? First of all, in terms of the numbers, we have 20 well-being indicators. I'm just showing you 5 of them here. but they all improve. We have 68% of people are less burned out after 6 months on the 4-day week than they were beforehand. So we study people at what's called baseline before the trial starts. We actually have a 3-month, then at 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, we're following them. And they are less burned out. They have higher job satisfaction, better self-reported mental health, physical health, more positive emotions, less anxiety, less fatigue, better work-family balance, etc. I'll show you a few more. These are some numbers from a model that we have to sort of ask the question, well, what is it that's driving these well-being results? Why are people less burned out? Why do they have more positive feelings? The bigger the reduction in working hours, the stronger the improvement in well-being. And we find that it's due to two kinds of factors. One is sort of sleep and fatigue and exercise, so outside of work things. But the other really big thing is that people feel much more productive at work, only having to go 4 days. They feel more on top of their work. They feel more competent. They feel they're smarter at work. And that all has a big impact on their well-being. So these are some of the other ones. I've just talked about them, a whole range of satisfaction, people sleeping more, people sleeping better, exercising more, etc. On every one of these, we have statistically significant, these are those asterisks here, improvements. Companies are also very, very positive. The average company rating of the trial on a 1 to 10 is an 8.5. They think that their productivity is a 7.5, performance is a 7.5. And this is a slide just looking at how many stop. So how many are sort of failing at the 4-day week. And overall, after 1 year, we're only seeing about 20 of our nearly 200 companies reverted. And if you take out a few who stopped right at the beginning and never really gave it a chance, it's just about a 7% reduction, 7% reversion to a 5-day week. So I could go on and on and on about how it works, how much improvements people find, and so forth. I guess the last thing I'll say about that, and then I'm going to wrap up, and we can get into the Q&A. And actually, I'm going to stop my timer so we don't hear that awful noise. That we do interviews with the workers too, and we also ask them there's a comment section in our survey. And what we see is just, enormous outpouring of people saying things like life-changing, transformative, the best thing that ever happened to me, the best thing that ever happened to me except having my kids. I might be dead today because I only went to the doctor on that Friday because I had the day off, and I probably wouldn't have gone otherwise. And I found out I had cancer. And who knows what would have happened if I was still on a 5-day week. Or all the people who were able to go to therapy, physical therapy, mental therapy, because they have that extra day. Or the people who are telling us how they're getting off their antidepressants and their other medications, or now they can get pregnant, which they couldn't before. I mean, just thing after thing, just really an absolute outpouring of this is a game changer. And that brings me back to where I started with the idea of, is there something that can get us off the growth path that will be politically popular, that is not, oh, we have to sacrifice for the climate? Because I don't think Americans are going to do that. Not something that's going to raise prices for people, like a carbon tax. Or this is something that actually can allow us to do what I call powering down. And we're also measuring, does the 4-day week benefit the climate? Now, here our findings are much more modest. And in part, that's because this particular innovation happened at a time when there's so much work from home and not much commuting happening. But if we were in a normal time in which people were driving 5 days a week to work, you would have seen a much bigger impact. I mean, as it is, commute time falls, a very small reduction in the number of people who commute to work by car. We're not seeing a travel rebound. That is, people are not suddenly traveling a lot because they have those 3-day weekends. That was something we were worried about. People estimate that their carbon footprint has gone down, and they also say that they're more likely, very slightly more likely, to walk or cycle instead of using their car. And we're looking into much more detailed and kind of accurate ways of figuring out what happened to the climate. The one thing I'll say here is, because this is an innovation that was enacted with no reduction in income, the expectation is it wouldn't have nearly as much impact on the climate as going forward if people were trading income for time. So if we were taking productivity growth and instead of expanding production, we were reducing work hours, and we can talk more about that. But so these are very modest impacts here from this study, but I think what they do give us is a kind of tailwind to help us as we try and decarbonize, because the more we reduce work time, the easier it is to pull that carbon out of the atmosphere. We are finally starting to see some legislative activity. In March, Bernie Sanders held a hearing, which I had the great privilege of testifying at, and it was called Should Workers Benefit from New Technology and Increase Productivity? The Need for a 32-Hour Week with No Loss in Pay. It was at the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, and UAW President Shawn Fain was also there advocating for a 32-hour standard work week. What about the other 3 steps? Reduce extreme inequality, address racism, and restore democracy. Work time reduction won't automatically solve these problems. It does help, but we also need other things: wealth taxes, a universal basic income. We need reparations and a strong anti-racist agenda. MAGA has thrived on inequality, racial and gender resentment, and a cycle of progress and backlash, and we really need to shut that down. And I think that together with decarbonization and meeting people's needs, giving them this really amazing, transformative innovation, I think we can make progress on peace and sustainability. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Julie. That was quite a whirlwind, and we're really impressed and thrilled to see this positive potential. Before I go to the questions that are in the chat, and we're going to be calling people from their questions in the chat, not from a raised hand, I want to take the privilege of the facilitator and ask you a direct question, and that is, I don't see any breakdown in your studies for, that was my timer. Got to turn off. On gender diversity, and also on the type of work that you're decreasing to. And as we move to more human services and basic human needs and direct care, how does the 4-day work week affect decarbonization, and how does it affect mental health?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It really, just because of time, I didn't get into any of the subjects and so forth. A couple things on gender. Two things. Number one, the employees in these companies there is a skew toward women. So it's about, I think, 64% female. And they are predominantly white collar industries. Not only, though, we have manufacturing firms, we have construction, we have restaurants, we have retail shops. So it is a mix, but largely white collar. As I mentioned also, they tend to be small companies, although we have more, as time goes on, we're getting more bigger companies. So for example, in our 3rd trial, we had 1,000 people from one company, and it was so successful, all 5,000 of them are now, implementing. But that's an interesting one, because that's in healthcare. and Human Services. They provide staffing for residential homes for young people and who are in care and so forth. And one of the things that we found as time went on, and I think this is due to two things. One is, as we got so much attention for this work, and it began to be seen as like, oh, maybe this could work, something more viable. A number of the companies in the trials started because their CEO or founder or president or whatever read an article in the New York Times about this, and they're like, I think that could work at my company. So over time, we got more openness from healthcare and human services, and I start getting queries from, particularly in this local human service providers. And we have a 35,000 person hospital chain in New Jersey that was in one of our trials, and they gave the 4-day week to their nurse managers. And there are you're seeing more and more in nurses. Why? So in these social service agencies and the healthcare agencies, what's happening is massive attrition. And people are leaving the field altogether. They can't keep them there. And they're unable to give and I think for some of these people, a wage increase wouldn't even do it. They can't give wages big enough to keep them. And even if that doesn't solve the burnout, and the burnout is very real. Nurses, of course, being, the most famously burned out profession, and then the number one largest healthcare professional group in the country. And what's happening is the attrition is stopped dead in its tracks. In fact, in the nurses group in our study, people rescinded their resignation letters when they heard about the program. And we're seeing this pretty much across the board. When people get this 4-day week, it is so valuable, they do not leave. And it's not just in healthcare and human services, but we have a 1,000-person human service organization now, local, that we're working with. We're putting a researcher, one of my grad students, in there to be like on the ground watching what's happening, and we're surveying them. And so, yes, it's happening across a wide range of types of work.
Great. Thank you so much. I see a question from Harris Grumman. Are you still here, Harris?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
Oh, well, welcome.
Hey, Harris, very nice to see you.
Welcome to ask your question.
Yeah, no, how could I miss this webinar with Juliet Schor? Well, I'm asking this question. I mean, I'm the leader of a union with its majority human service people and direct care people who are mostly women and mostly people of color. But I'm asking this question, which may seem a little tendentious from the point of view, because after the great financial crisis, crash of 2008, we had tremendous success. I mean, we had some of the best successes I've seen in my entire career, like, doubled the minimum wage, created a Scandinavian level of paid family medical leave, created the first progressive income tax in the state for 115 years. And we did it all on a slogan, which was, we are the 99% and there's the 1%. And everybody understood it. And all this came to a halt, I found, around 2018 with the sort of insertion into all that, mainly coming from the liberal business community about racial wealth gaps. And so I asked the question, I mean, in a period when the white working, or white middle class, the proprietary working class, we could call it, as Piketty does, is seeing its wealth decline by 33%, which is pretty, I mean, your chart showed, I mean, it's pretty shocking, really. I ask, isn't emphasizing a racial wealth gap a divisive strategy? I mean, why not emphasize lifting the bottom X% of people, or why not, lifting, people to all have living incomes and enough wealth to be secure? In other words, emphasizing the wealth gap and not the racial wealth gap, which seems to imply that these people who've gone down 33% are somehow have, excessive, privilege and so on, which, arguably they do. But I mean, it's still but it's not excessive. It's just relative. And that, you know, I mean, I think that's partly responsible for this new horror we're in, which is the new regime in Washington we're going to have to deal with in a month. You know, we've divided the working class, not so much in my membership, but, you know, across the union movement and outside the union movement because of that message, you know. And so that's your fourth point. And I wonder if that fourth point is actually not, I mean, if it's going to done, I mean, racism, yes, let's fight that. But the racial wealth gap implies like a kind of hierarchy of oppression or whatever. I mean, it seems to me, I mean, tell me I'm wrong.
I don't think so. So yeah, I mean, I absolutely would agree with you that it's about the 1 and the 99, and that is the dominant frame, and that's a really powerful, important frame. But we have to recognize that within the working class, we have these differences, and we have to build that unified working class. And part of doing that is fighting racism, and I think you just said you agree with that. And if you think historically about the sort of progressive forces that have been successful in trying to build that racially integrated working class, you have to address. You've got to address those differences. And so I think I mean, it's a delicate matter, but I think ignoring the fact that Black and Latin households have virtually no wealth, and building their wealth is really key. I mean, I'm giving a seminar here. I'm not like, in a union hall or whatever, and I did have 3 slides about, the 1 and the 99, but I think to ignore the racial differences is a trap. And so we got to figure out, I don't disagree. I mean, we have to figure out how to do it in a way that doesn't divide the working class. But I think not talking about it doesn't work. And, a lot of this came from, I know, Tom Shapiro at Brandeis, did a lot of the early work on the Black-white wealth gap. So I don't know that it came from corporate liberals or whatever. I mean, that's late. This work had been going on earlier. You're more in the political world than I am, so I won't venture to say how it has worked out. But I guess I would just say I think I will take your excellent point and say let's figure out a way to talk about Black and Latin households' wealth building that isn't divisive. That's what we need to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's the time period. We're in a decline of the proprietary working class. If we weren't, obviously back in the 60s, the civil rights movement actually was very strong because the white working class was strong. Like it was a better time to say, hey, like let's not forget, everybody else. And it just seems now we're in a period where it sounds like we don't care that the white working class has had a dive, particularly the middle class white working class, the ones who own homes and things like that. And that comes across as hostile to people, I think. So, yeah, you're right. I mean, the only way to deal with it is to think harder about it.
Yeah.
Shall we move on?
Yeah.
Please.
Okay,
Yeah.
there was a question from someone named DK. I'm going to read the question because I don't see DK here. Is that you, Dennis?
There's actually a DK in the meeting.
Yeah, there's a
Oh, sorry,
DK
it's
in the
not me.
meeting. Who you're a bit later.
I'm DD.
DK, yeah, you're DD. DK, you here? Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, you unmuted, but then you immediately muted yourself again. Just click it once. There you go. Nope, you went back and muted again. If DK is stuck on that, maybe they could put their question in the chat and
They
somebody.
did put the question in the chat. I'll just read the question. Are you there, DK?
They're here, they're just muted.
Okay, I'll read the question. How would decarbonizing change the USA's relationship with Israel, which both parties have confirmed a solid relationship with, and with the surrounding countries? Thank you. And I would also add that decarbonization affects relationships with all the oil and fossil producing companies. So yes, Israel is a question, but writ large, how do we negotiate that change in relationship?
So this one's kind of above my pay grade. I would just say, I don't think it will have that much of an impact on our relationship to Israel. Israel is not an oil producing country. We are not, the United States is not connected to Israel because it's sitting on top of oil. That is not the case for all the other countries in the region. But I think that what's going on between the US and Israel is really based on other things. So it's not going to solve that problem. It will open up more possibilities for the US with all of the other states in West Asia. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's going to dramatically change, as you noted, the decarbonization and the moving from a fossil fuel economy is going to change the balance of power globally. It's got to be negotiated very carefully. But there are huge opportunities in that. Gary Goldstein had a question. Gary, do you want to come up and ask your question? Are you still here?
I'm here, sure.
Hi.
Yes, simple
Gary.
question.
Yeah.
I'm not an economist. I've always wondered what the GDP consists of. And seeing that it's on an exponentially increasing curve, I'm wondering how we benefit from this. What is productivity anyway? And why is it making the wealthy wealthier?
And I want to add to that good question, Gary, that GDP was never intended to be an indication of quality of life or quality of the country. It was meant to be a temporary measure. And Dennis has some very good comments in the chat about things that GDP does not include: basic goods and services, the cost of war, reconstruction, the cleanup of oil spills, et cetera, you know. So
but the production of widgets that include nuclear missiles, which are now being produced at a great rate. Yes.
So
well, Dennis's point was it doesn't only include, it does include the cleanup and the advertising. So this is one of the points about it. It's like if something bad happens to let's say an oil spill, there's no reduction in the value of the natural capital, which has occurred, but you get an increase in GDP with all the activity to try and mitigate it. So it's a very problematic measure in the sense that it only includes certain things. You know, the famous example from economics is, of course, it's always, if a man marries his housekeeper, the GDP goes down because he used to pay her wages, which got counted, and now he doesn't. Domestic labor, which is about as much in terms of time that the people spend doing unpaid work in domestic work and some community work, is about equal to the amount of time that people spend in the paid economy, and none of that is counted in the GDP. So, but your question is what contributes to growth, and you know, there are three components. One is government spending, One is investment and the other is consumption. And then there's the trade balance, exports and imports, and the balance of those. So if you export more than you import, your GDP goes up, and conversely. Some countries are more investment driven, so that growth is typically propelled by increases in investment. So for a long time, Japan was in that category, where they were investing a lot and not consuming so much. The US is typically thought of as a consumer-driven economy, where we have a bigger percentage of our GDP going toward consumption. And the other thing is, of course, it's a little bit of a fraud, because countries that invest a lot eventually get to consume a lot. So, yeah, those, and then of course for total GDP, population matters too.
But there's also productivity, which is a mystery to me, because the most productive countries would have slavery. Yes. And so
No.
the more you get people working, the more productive they are.
Well, no, not in the way they may produce more, but if you think, I mean, typically we think about it productivity per unit of time. And so slavery was actually not such a productive system, because they overworked people and didn't give them enough food and so forth. The countries with the really high productivity are, I mean, you've got two things. One, you've got education, you have technology, but the other really cool thing is the countries with short hours of work have really high hourly productivity. So that's what we're seeing in these studies. I didn't talk about that side of it, but a lot of these companies talk about how their workers are more productive in 4 days than they were in 5. And what's fascinating to me is in the 1920s, when the manufacturers were studying these companies who were going from 6 to 5 days, they were saying the same thing, that they're actually getting, a lot of them were saying their productivity was going up, or it was at least staying the same, so their hourly productivity was going up.
Oh, those were the efficiency experts. Yes.
So I want to move on to Timon's question, and Timon Wallace had to leave, but his question is very much related to what we were just talking about. And he says, your charts showed the GDP kept going up at the same time as your other chart shows that work week was declining. So how do you think cutting more hours will help reduce the growth economy? So we're talking about cutting hours and being more productive, but what about, how does this affect the growth economy? And
So,
can we
yeah.
put some connection between productive and put some qualifiers on it, because production isn't not necessarily good for the economy. I mean, good for the environment. There are many activities.
Absolutely. Yes. So yes, I mean, what you produce really matters. You can be, there's no question about that. That's kind of obvious. But to answer his question, so what was happening from 1870 to 1970 was phenomenal productivity growth. So you had the growth of mass production and automation and tremendous increases in education and literacy and all these things that were happening. And the reductions, and you had some of that productivity growth being taken in the form of shorter hours, and some of it being taken in the form of expanded incomes, i.e. an expanding economy. So these economies were doing both with their productivity growth. They were reducing hours and growing at the same time. All right. Now we're in a world in which growth is lower, particularly in the rich countries, which is what my presentation was oriented to. So we're not going to get 4 or 5% growth. We're going to get 2% maybe, and we're going to have productivity growth. We could have some really big productivity growth coming up with artificial intelligence and all these technological developments. I'm not saying we could, I said, it's a little more complicated, but let's just say we do. So what I'm proposing is that we take all of that productivity growth and what that would do is it would stabilize the size of the economy. So rather than 1% growth and 1% work time reduction, all of it goes to work time reduction. We keep the size of the economy constant, let's just say for a constant population. We're doing all that technological decarbonization. So we're doing everything we can to get off fossil fuels and reduce emissions and so forth. And another key thing, and this back to Harris's point, really key, our average levels of income are really high. Our problem is the distribution. So we can bring a lot of people's incomes up with a more redistributive program. And that's why I put inequality right in there as a key dimension of this. So it can't just be about work time reduction. That'll stabilize average. We can stabilize average incomes and then we redistribute and we don't have to grow. People can get better off because they have more time and more money. If we're going to pull it down from the people who have amassed obscene amounts of wealth and income.
Great. Thank you. I think that Rob Moore's question follows that very nicely. Rob, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, yes, thank you.
Great. Thank you, because it fits.
So my question is that we Americans have been responsible for massive amounts of carbon in the atmosphere, and that stays there for thousands of years or 1,000 years. And so why do we not work as hard at drawing down more carbon dioxide with more vegetation, more soils, more permeable pavers for more water in the ground, as we do at working at the carbon reduction talk that you've been talking about? So might that be might restoring the climate and the hydrological cycle and more nature in neighborhoods be a sixth step to the sustainability and peace?
That is such a great point. And I support those activities very strongly. I work with the 350, the Better Future Project, which is the parent organization of 350 Mass. And we have one of our programs is called CREW, and we're doing a lot of depaving in that program. I invite you to learn more about it. Send me an email.
I know about it. I'm in Somerville. I know it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And we're doing it in other places too, but I would put these activities, to me, these are part of a decarbonization program. We're decarbonizing the atmosphere through these. So, I mean, you could call it a sixth step, but it is part of a decarbonization program. I think the other point, though, that, the reason I focused on fossil fuels is we can't keep burning fossil fuels. We do have to, we got to
I agree.
stop.
That is definitely a step. But on the other hand, if we could restore nature in our neighborhoods, that right now the wealthy people go on weekends to nature and the rest of us are stuck with what we got. And so that would help with the fossil fuel burning and stuff, or the transportation. Another thing is that after the Civil War, there was a lot of reconstruction going on and cutting down of forests to rebuild. And George Perkins Marsh said, look, if this cutting continues, there will not be enough water in the ground for the Erie Canal to operate, and New York's burgeoning economy is going to crash. And so New York bought up to not quite 10,000 square miles of Adirondacks forests to keep the water in the ground. And now we have the Mississippi running low, and people are cursing the carbon in the atmosphere while the land barons are making money hand over fist. So we need to also bring attention to, if you graft the way that our loss of soil and vegetation since World War II, you're going to get the same kind of hockey stick graph that we got with the fossil fuel use with the bend happening in the 50s and stuff. So I think it's important not just to rally about, it may be better for the climate to put a potted plant on your front doorstep than to turn in your your gas automobile for an electric automobile. There's a lot of kind of, yeah. So I don't like the way that aspect keeps getting pushed away and everyone's worried about decarbonizing when we've got to pull it down.
I got to tell you something. I support all the things that you're talking about, but number one, there's a lot of that happening. So to say that nobody's paying attention to it is wrong. There's been huge amounts of attention to carbon sequestration and farming and so forth. You're seeing a lot of
You're right.
innovation.
I shouldn't have said that. That was wrong.
Could you just let me finish, please?
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, the idea that putting a plant on your porch is going to do as much as stopping driving around with an internal combustion engine, I mean, that's just very false. It's just not.
Right. But thank you for promoting the drawdown of carbon more. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
We have a couple more questions that are in the chat. Thank you, Julie. I appreciate that. I just want to ask Dennis, Dennis Cathalder?
Yeah.
Did you want to say something not only about GDP, but also about your degrowth group?
Yes. Well, I did put a question in the chat, but I forgot to put a Q in front of it. But that I can do both or well, okay. So I did put my email in the chat. So I've been in a discussion group with Paula and Rosalie, and Rosalie and I and several other people are still continuing these kinds of discussions. We call it a degrowth discussion group, but we've used the term post-growth. We talked about a lot of these different aspects that you're talking about. It's a really great presentation you gave, by the way, Julie. I'm really, really happy that you did this. And okay, so I put my email in the chat. I'll do it again on the bottom here, just so people see it. So anyone who wants to join that conversation, further conversation, my email is in the chat now. And we're having a meeting in January. I'll send out a Zoom link to anybody that's interested, January 9th at 3 p.m. Okay.
So
my question,
the growth group. Now, if you want to ask you that, so
okay.
there's a growth discussion group.
Exactly.
Much with Dennis. If you want to join it, now your question.
Thank you, Paula. All right. So my question was, let me just bring it back up. Okay. So there are really two things related here, but I tried to concentrate on the wealth aspect rather than we have limited time to deal with reducing carbon emissions. We basically have to cut it in half by 2030, according to the UN study. But the other thing is that given the election results, and I've been debriefing with all kinds of people, I really believe what Bernie is saying, that the Democrats didn't no longer really try to appeal to the working class, but that the billionaires stepped in and, with their lies and propaganda, basically, they got the working class to vote for Donald Trump. And so my question is, so I understand we can appeal to companies to reduce work hours. It'll improve people's efficiency, productivity, whatever. And how do we appeal to the working class? Because without the working class, how can we move the country in the direction that we need to do? How do we convince them that we can reduce we can reduce working hours without reducing wages? And maybe these are many questions, I don't know. That we can actually increase wages and benefits and explain that the racial gap will not reduce the wages of whites.
Yeah, so
questions.
And this gets us also back to Harris's point, and Betsy Leander Wright has put some good stuff in the chat, so that's what's going on. To me, one of the things I like about the 4-day week especially is that it is extremely popular across, pretty much it's across the income groups, across race. I mean, everybody loves the 4-day week. And, you know, Harris made the point about white, sort of the proprietary white working class. So these are homeowner working class, of course, and they may be middle class in some sense, but there are a lot of other people in this country. I mean, we need the working class, but we also need the middle class and, you know, probably the upper middle class too. And all of these, this is a very popular intervention across all of these. And it's a very, very unifying one rather than a dividing kind of thing, if it's something that we can get for lots of people. So you had the you had the head of the auto workers there making the point that manufacturing workers are on 12-hour shifts in this country. And, you know, it's horrible for them. They never get to see their kids. They don't have lives outside of work, et cetera. They have a lot of forced overtime. So a work time reduction agenda. So it doesn't have to be just like a rigid, oh, everybody only works Monday through Thursday. That doesn't work for a lot of companies, et cetera. But basically, you know, a more flexible work time reduction agenda in which everybody is getting work time reduction, whether you're a low wage worker or you're a higher wage worker, you're a professional or you're salaried or you're hourly. I mean, that's a very, very popular agenda. And it's one that I think is economically feasible and one that really transforms people's lives in very, very positive ways. So to the extent that we can start getting some victories here, it's really something we can point to. And of course, it was at the core of what labor movements were fighting for you know, throughout the 19th and well into the 20th century, and still are in other parts of the country and at least of the world, and starting to here to a certain extent.
And do these programs, sorry, quick follow-up, do these programs guarantee the same wages with less hours?
Yes, all
Okay.
works. So everyone's getting an hourly wage increase. And a really interesting thing, I mean, the people in these companies that we're seeing for the most part are not, you know, they're not minimum wage workers, but we're seeing no increase in second job holding, which is something that really surprised me, because I thought in the United States at least, I thought we'd see, and there's a history. The Kellogg workers, for example, when they got the 6-hour day, the men went and took on other jobs, and we're just not seeing that at all, which is really interesting.
Huh.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful.
Very
We
interesting.
have just a couple of minutes left, and I just wanted to note a couple of questions. I'm just going to read them quickly and just see if you can give us some direction on them. Okay, Julie? So Kate Zatzik Hamtrak said, with the change in U.S. administration and its goals, what's the projected impact of the positive changes that you've discussed on sustainability and justice? That's one question. And I think a related question that Peter Schultz put out, 805, I have to find it, was, with our increasingly globalized world, when other countries catch up with the US in regard to education, infrastructure, et cetera, will the US have a harder time being globally competitive when labor rates are much less continuous with the rest of the world?
Okay, so on the latter one, I mean, this has been going on for a long time. We've already felt a lot of the brunt of this, and you know, partly how countries cope with that is through productivity increases, and that's one of the nice things about work time reduction, because it spurs hourly productivity increases. So I think I don't think it's a problem. I mean, I think we don't need to have a big, and we shouldn't have a big standard of living gap compared to the rest of the world. That's not, the title of this thing was Sustainable and Peaceable. So in a peaceable world, we don't have these giant differentials in standards of living, which came about in large part, in many cases, because of colonialism and imperialism and wealth extraction from global colonized areas. So I'm not so worried about that. I think that we can maintain competitiveness. I mean, not, we will lose the labor intensive industries that don't have a lot of capital and knowledge involved, and we've lost most of those anyway, and that's okay. I think what we should do is like double down on developing ecological technologies which have a pro-ecological thing, which not as many countries are doing. And on the first one, that's a really hard question. I think we're all sort of wondering what the impact of this administration is going to be. We're going to have a huge fight about fossil fuels, and we should. And was it Tom, the person who was asking about talking about the carbon sequestration and plant-based and soil sequestration and so forth. And Bob, yeah. So we're going to have to, if we lose the fossil fuel fight, we're going to have to do a lot more of that, which we have to do anyway. But so we've got the fight on our hands with the fossil fuels. Some of it, of what's happening, I think they're going to have a hard time reversing. I mean, Texas is not going to stop building wind farms just because Donald Trump is in the White House, fortunately, and California has done an enormous amount on shifting to renewables, and they've actually finally started to see big declines in fossil fuel use in this last year. Really, for the first time, their renewables have increased so much that they're having a collapse of natural gas consumption, which is fantastic, finally. So I think a lot of that will continue. And, we've got just the impact on justice, and we have a fight unlike anything that we've had in the lifetimes of the people on this call that we are facing now, and I think we all kind of understand that.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate Julie Schor and all of our MAPA colleagues and our guests in trying to think about what a different kind of world would look like, how a sustainable and peaceful economy could take us to a different and better place, and welcome you to continue this journey with us. Share a vision, share the work. And Cole, our administrative director, if you want to say anything more about MAPA and what it's doing, I just want to thank you again, Julie. This was an amazing presentation, and I'm hoping that we'll have the recording up, and we'll continue the conversation, because this is the beginning of a really important conversation. It's a gift.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a privilege to. It's
Thanks,
privilege
Paula.
to be
Thanks.
here, and I appreciate the opportunity, and it's great to engage with all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paula, and thanks, Julie. And before I forget, Julie, there was somebody that some of your earlier slides that was so detailed that they couldn't read the writing, and wondered if you would be willing to share your slides. And if so, we would send it in the follow-up message to the people that registered, so they can read all the details.
Yeah, that would be great.
Thanks. Yeah, so MAPA is a volunteer-led, volunteer-driven organization, and we depend on you to join our work. We have 4 priority campaigns right now. One is Gaza, Israel, Mideast Peace Campaign. One is Ukraine, Time for Peace. One is Fund the People, Not the Pentagon. And one is the twin threats of nuclear war and climate change. And then we have, so those are our 4 priorities. And then we have a number of other working groups. One of them is the Peace and Climate Group that Rosalie co-chairs and Paula participates in. And so please get in touch and join one of those groups, get involved. We need your energy, we need your ideas. And then at this time of year, we also need your money. We're in our fall fund drive. Let me see if I can share this. And we have $64,000 more that we need to raise by the end of the year. So please dig deep, and I'm going to put a link in which you can make your donation to MAPA or to MAPA Education Fund if you want to make a tax deductible donation. Thanks everyone for being here. We appreciate it so much. Let's get to work.
Stay healthy, stay happy, stay green.